Welcome. My name is Whitney Lee. I'm a developer advocate here at VMware Tanzu, and I'm here with my friend Oren. Oren, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hey everyone, I'm Oren Tanzu. I'm the Director of Product Strategy, and I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited too. So glad. We're going to have a big conversation today. We're going to tackle the question, what is Tanzu? But before we get into that, what I would like to know is, what was the world like before Tanzu? What problem is Tanzu solving?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So Tanzu is basically answering the fundamental question of how do you manage and how do you deliver application in the new cloud native world. And to answer that, let's talk about the challenge itself. So before that, we had simple world. We had one server, we had one application running on it. Everything was easy, and we didn't had a lot of servers, right? Um, and when we, like 20 years ago, a small company called VMware divided that physical server into virtualization. So virtual server running on that physical one.
And what problem was that solving?
Yeah, well, that was another like evolution of hardware and software. So when the hardware became so powerful to run more than one application, it was just a waste to run one piece of code on one server. So we divided that into multiple virtual servers. But we will get to that later. It's exactly like what we saw a couple of years ago with Kubernetes. So we've abstracted from physical to virtual, but then there was a lot of challenges doing that because those virtual servers had new network, new management stack, new way of like connecting storage and other things. Very infrastructure focused, and that was like the evolution back there was basically more an infrastructure driven, and which is also different between like what we saw in the last 10 years with Kubernetes and microservices. But that was the beginning of, breaking up silos and into different small parts that you can then manage and act fast with. Like, think about managing or upgrading that server. It was one server, one application. You're upgrading it. The server is down. Now you have 30, 40 VMs on one server. You can think about like a couple of them running the same application exactly. And now you can think about rolling upgrades, and you can think about like maybe not having that amount of downtime. And it's now in the next evolution of microservices, it's also not a monolith. So each part of that piece of application is running independently. So you can restart that or you can move that without affecting the other parts of the application.
Nice. So it's resource utilization, it's isolation between applications, it's being able to have more complex deployment strategies.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
But again, it like initially that was mostly around hardware, and it was mostly infrastructure that evolved that technology into the organization. The reason I'm emphasizing that is because in the last, like, let's say 10 years since cloud native computing and microservices and the 12 factors and everything else, the one that pushed the technology into the organization was the developers, not the infrastructure. So for everything before the last microservices architecture change, everything was driven by infrastructure. And the last evolution was driven by developers and was driven by, and that's super important because that will explain why, right? When you think about why are we talking about microservices and containers that are basically around since the 50s or 60s. It's not something new. But now the challenge is even bigger because if we talked about ratios and numbers. If you had one server that became 30, 40 VMs, now each VM will be 200, 300 containers. And it will be managed by different orchestration stacks. So the reason that we have those challenges is because we have, from one hand, a lot of capabilities. We have smaller parts. We can independently update them and manage them. We can iterate fastly. We can basically answer the marketing and business demand, right? One of the things that you saw, the digital transformation or the digital age, is giving the customers what they want and what they need as fast as you can to get the competitive advantage against whoever is
Yeah.
in front of you. And to
Yeah.
do that, you have to have the tools. So
Uh-huh.
when you talk about like an architecture for microservices, one of the things is you're talking about like the 12 factors of microservices. There's a couple of
Uh-huh.
things that you need to align. Now, it's always funny that the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you have like the capability to restart your component without affecting anything else. Because if you can restart it, you can upgrade it, you can manipulate it without affecting the other things of like the other parts of the application. So that was a long intro of what's the challenge, but there's a lot of challenges with microservices and running it across, different stacks and orchestrations.
So before Tanzu, we had physical servers, we had virtualization, we have containers, and then like breaking up monoliths into microservices. But all of this is infrastructure driven evolution. And and it's important, but so far the developer experience has been left in the dust. Like we're concerned with doing things faster because being fast is everything. Like in terms of getting your product first, it's not necessarily the best thing, it's the fastest delivered thing. And as these upgrades are happening, um, the developers are having to take on some of this infrastructure concern.
So,
Am I capturing it well?
well, yeah. First of all, of course, the challenge that they have, like both sides have challenges, developers and
Uh-huh.
infrastructure. The one that changed like the architecture of the application and because of that driven the change of infrastructure was the developers because they wanted to break into microservices, and the break to microservices, the goal for that was to iterate faster and to get that velocity of application into production, right? That's basically like the chain of events. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of moving parts in this chain, and we will get into like what are the path to production. How do you take code and push that into production in that cloud native world, in that new world of technology? But
Mm-hmm.
another thing that is super important to this evolution is also a methodological one, like something that is more process driven, which is DevOps. In the old world of physical servers and virtualization, what used to happen with developers is they would have compiled the binary and just throw it over the fence, right, to production
Uh-huh.
for someone to run it. And when we broke things apart into microservices and we start using a lot of new kind of DevOps methodologies, we also
Uh-huh.
change the way that we are handling things between the different pieces and parts of that path to production. Now, all of that is an intro for platforms in general. Why do you need a platform, right? Like, why do you need some automation and orchestration of the different steps from code into
Uh-huh.
production? And then how do you also navigate between the different stakeholders and personas and teams in that path? Because there's a lot of challenges, as I said, from the developer. How do you develop? How do you push? How do you focus only on code and nothing else? Because there's a lot of things that you need to think about. And then from the infrastructure side, how do you manage 200 containers in each VM, 40 VMs for physical server, and you have 1,000 servers, right? So that's the challenge from the other side.
So I think what I want to capture here is actually list those challenges. So we have challenges for operations and challenges for developers at this point
Yep.
right now. Okay, so let's list challenges for operations.
So the first thing about the challenges for operations is the number of containers or components or workloads running.
Uh-huh.
The number of workloads running is exponentially growing with microservices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the outcome of that challenge is everything from security management, cost management, policy, consistency. There's a lot,
Ooh.
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that it's not solvable only with platform. Like there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
things that you can you can address and you can simplify the complexity, but it's still going to
Mm-hmm.
be complex because now you also, on the infrastructure side, you also talk about where you're running those workloads. So there's another trend and another like huge wave of technology, which is the cloud that came in the last 10 years, that also allows you to now decide where do you want to land and which services do you want to consume and why do you want to consume those services and not others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from the infrastructure side that used to manage a data center in their own premise, and now they
Mm-hmm.
need to think about public clouds and public cloud tools and services and where it's right to run those different services and different workloads. That's a huge challenge.
It makes the days of like one application per one physical server seem like really like quaint and,
Yeah,
and sweet. Like, oh.
exactly. But that's exactly it. So the challenge is huge. It's beyond something you can actually cope with, like as an infrastructure. So I came from the customer side for most of my life, and I'm still like I'm still part of that mindset of thinking about how and where can I manage my internal teams and my workloads, and just thinking about like a cross cloud scenarios where you want to land on one cloud because of specific capabilities that you want to leverage, but from the other end you have regulations and policies and you have to stay on prem for data privacy and other things. It's just like it's a mess, it's a problem, it's a real problem. And that's also some of the things that a platform can solve, because one, I think the most important piece of like um, the way that you can solve that, the most important thing is consistency. If you will have consistency in the way that you develop, in the way that you build, in the way that you push into production, no matter where, right? No matter where the workload will land, it will land with the same policies, same sets of parameters, same backup and security
I
policies.
wanna I
Yeah.
wanna dig into that, and I agree, and I want to get it on the board. But before we do, I want to talk about challenges for developers, and then we'll move on to the platform part.
So the
Yeah.
challenges for developers, well, there's a lot. Again, developers also had to change and evolve with those microservices. And again, I can remember some times where you didn't had 30 different languages to choose from, which
Mm-hmm.
you in an enterprise organization you still don't, but you now have more options to develop in different languages for different use cases. So think
Uh
about
huh.
like developing in different languages and then create the pipelines for those different languages, and each language and team
Mm-hmm.
will probably gonna have different path to production. That's where you get, I don't know, 1,000 pipelines into production that each and every one of them looks different, uses different tools. So that
Mm-hmm.
cognitive load of tools and technologies they will need to think about and manage and use as part of that is huge. Another important, it's not important, but I think that one another challenge of the developers is to think about other services they need to use as part of their application. So they will
Mm-hmm.
probably gonna need services. The application that they are writing will probably gonna use cache layers or message queuing or databases or cloud services they will need to consume. Um, and that's even before getting
Mm-hmm.
into policies and regulations that they don't even know about, or if they do, they need to address and they need to make sure that they are in line with. Um, I'll give you some time to
So,
write.
so what I'm hearing, but what I'm also putting together, I have room for one more. I'm gonna write policy and regulation. Um, so now, like the consistency element is making a ton of sense because if you have tens, hundreds, maybe thousands of dev teams, and they're all choosing to solve these problems in different ways, then having to integrate any two services with each other becomes a beast. It becomes its own unique, complex problem. Where when you said consistency, like if everything's built on the same foundations, then integrating two microservices with each other, it should be more straightforward.
Exactly. It's it allows you to reduce that the snowflakes. And when
Snowflakes. I like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
because when you create those different paths and you create those different services that you need to use, and you create, by the way, you multiply your services, because you don't, like, some of the times you don't even know that you can reuse something or connect to something. So that's reducing those snowflakes for the developers. Now, another thing that developers are investing time on today is
Mhm.
security. When they have to think about it, because again, we are back in like the DevSecOps kind of methodology, where they have responsibility to create the code and use the dependencies that has the least amount of vulnerabilities, or when it's going to get into production, they will get that snowball back into them, because they need the change should happen in the code and not in production or around the application. So security is a major challenge. We can talk about it later. There's a lot of things to talk about in security, and I know you love security. So
I do like security. Yeah.
that's definitely something that we will talk about. But I think that's the challenge. And another thing that I've briefly mentioned about the numbers. When you think about those numbers of containers and VMs, that's also the number of applications. So
Yeah.
another thing that changed is that a lot of companies in the last, I don't know, 10 years are developing homegrown application way more than buying off the shelf. So they have
Oh.
a lot of bits and bytes of application they will need to manage and write and maintain and update and repair.
I don't know, like, if just writing the words wild amount of complexity like really does it justice. I'm like, how can I like convey the gravity of all the complexity?
I,
I'm
I,
not sure how to.
I think we like there's too much, right? Like the complexity and the challenges that we have in the last 10 years around software and hardware. It's just it's too much. And that's why also
Yeah.
you saw a lot of like the entire landscape change, right? The entire CNCF community
Hmm.
landscape and the project that are rising and the platforms that was formed and the automation and orchestration and the configuration management in the cloud, and I can keep going, right? All of those things are trying to handle those challenges and to reduce those challenges and to allow customer to achieve what customers eventually need. And we need to start with that, because that's also the mission in life for Tanzu, is to accelerate the path to production, accelerate the application path to production. That's what customer wants. The way to achieve that can be different, but that's what eventually what they want. They want the competitive advantage over anyone else in the market.
So, do you think now would be a good time to write like maybe a succinct definition of what Tanzu is?
I think we can start with like the mission in life of Tanzu, which is to accelerate the application path to production. That's the statement. Like that's what we here to do. Uh, and everything that we will talk about on what is Tanzu eventually connects into this line, right? That's the mission that we have. How do we accelerate the path to production? How do we simplify the application path to production? How do we secure that, manage that, you know,
Do you want
address
me to just put accelerate or do you want me to put simplify,
no, 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 no.
secure,
The,
manage?
the statement is accelerate the application path to production.
Okay. Uh, the application's path to production or just the
Yeah.
path to production?
The
Okay.
application path to production.
Okay.
That's another important thing. We are focusing on applications, less on everything else. Like there's a lot of things that we want to obstruct and we want to help our customer, you know, not thinking about it or don't like think about everything else underneath that. The application is what matters. Because eventually, if we are getting out of the business outcome, right? If the business outcome is to push and iterate as fast as it can into production,
Mm-hmm.
what matters is the application itself, the user experience, the iteration and velocity, and everything else around it. So the application is the core. When we will talk about those challenges on the Tanzu side, at least, everything on those challenges that we address is on the application context. We want the application
Mhm.
to be the center of everything, because the application eventually
Yeah.
brings that business value.
The ultimate way to measure the success of a platform is the success of the products of that company.
Exactly.
That's what it's all about. So let's not lose sight of that, right?
Exactly. Do you want to know a bit about like the history of Tanzu as well, or?
Yeah,